Morgan Freeman had always been drawn to mysteries. His voice, warm, resonant, and steeped in wisdom, had narrated countless tales on screen, yet there was a rare, unspoken drive within him that pushed him to seek out the world's hidden wonders in real life. He wasn't simply content to retell stories others had penned. Deep down, he longed to uncover moments that history had tried to bury, experiences that might transform not only those who witnessed them, but also the man who told them. It all began on a quiet afternoon in Los Angeles. Morgan was sipping a gentle brew of herbal tea, gazing through his study's large window. The world outside was drenched in sunlight, the palm trees swaying in a slow, lazy dance, as if to whisper that there was no better time than now to embark on something new. But he had no inkling that, on that same day, a distant phone call from an old acquaintance would redirect his path in a most extraordinary way. The phone rang, an old-fashioned landline that Morgan kept out of sentimental value. He still enjoyed the feel of lifting that heavier receiver, the metallic ring, and the subtle crackle of a connection that reminded him of times past. He glanced at the caller ID. The name was faint, distorted perhaps by the device's age, but he recognized the digits as belonging to someone from many years prior. Curiosity ignited within him. "Hello," Morgan said, his tone soft, but carrying that trademark resonance. "Morgan Freeman," began the voice on the other end, slightly breathless yet undeniably excited. "I can't believe I found you. It's Paul Weston from Well, It's Been Too Long." Morgan's eyes widened in pleasant surprise. Paul Weston was a documentary filmmaker Morgan had worked with on a smaller project 2 decades earlier, a short piece about a remote village's tradition of star navigation. Paul, just an upstart filmmaker then, had displayed the kind of curiosity and passion that Morgan admired. "Paul," Morgan replied with quiet warmth, setting his teacup aside. "I remember you. How have you been? You sound different." "I'm all right," Paul said, "but I'm in the midst of a conundrum. I've stumbled upon something. I can't talk about it over the phone, at least not fully. I need someone I trust, someone who can help me bring this story to the world. And if there's anyone who can narrate this, Morgan, it's you." Morgan was no stranger to such invitations. Over the years, countless people had beckoned him to their projects, hoping to capitalize on his distinctive voice. But something in Paul's tone hinted at more than just a professional request. There was an undercurrent of urgency, almost desperation. "Tell me a little," Morgan ventured, leaning forward. "Where are you, Paul?" Paul cleared his throat. "I'm in a small archipelago off the coast of, let's just say it's a place that hasn't fully opened its doors to the world yet. There's a legend here about a hidden lake deep in the jungle, rumored to have extraordinary properties. I thought it was just folklore until I saw, well, I can't say exactly. But Morgan, this could be monumental. Maybe not in the sense of global headlines, but in the sense of what it means for the human spirit. And I can't do it alone." Morgan remained silent for a long moment. The mention of a hidden lake and a rumor of something extraordinary was enough to send a shiver of anticipation through him. His mind teemed with questions. How remote was this place? Was it safe? Had Paul gotten himself in over his head? Yet, that spark of curiosity rekindled the old adventurous flame in him. A memory flashed across Morgan's thoughts. Decades before, when he was still forging his path in the acting world, he had once traveled to an isolated region of the Amazon to meet with a tribe that believed the spirits of their ancestors lived in ancient trees. He remembered how that journey had changed him, shaping a part of his spirit that no spotlight could ever touch. Paul's voice interrupted his brief reverie. "I'm telling you, Morgan, you'll want to see this for yourself. I've already arranged a small team, but, well, you're the missing piece." Morgan inhaled softly, letting the aroma of his team mix with a swirl of excitement building in his chest. "All right," he said with the calm authority of a man who had already decided. "Tell me what you need." Over the next hour, they discussed logistics. Paul wasn't entirely secretive. He explained that the archipelago was in a region rarely visited by tourists, inhabited by people who had guarded local legends for centuries. The lake was said to appear and disappear at different times of the year, as though possessed of its own will. Rumors spoke of animals not found in any textbook, of water so clear it reflected the sky like a mirror, and of voices echoing through the night, urging travelers to explore deeper into the unknown. Every sentence pulled Morgan closer to a decision. By the time the call ended, Morgan had agreed to meet Paul in a remote coastal city, the nearest modern port to the archipelago. From there, they would hire a boat, gather supplies, and set out to document, if possible, this hidden lake and the secrets it might hold. That evening, Morgan found himself pacing his study, that gentle swirl of anticipation refusing to let him rest. He glanced around at the photographs lining his shelves. There he was with various directors, with old friends from the sets of beloved films, shaking hands with luminaries in grand halls. And while those captured moments showcased a glorious career, Morgan sensed an emptiness in them now. They were snapshots of achievements, but they lacked the intangible spirit of fresh discovery. Something in Paul's voice had hinted that this next journey might not just be about the lake. Perhaps it would be about reinvigorating his own sense of wonder. The next morning, the sun rose over Los Angeles in a blaze of gold. Morgan booked a flight to the coastal city specified by Paul. He told only a few close friends of his plans, offering them few details. After all, he wasn't entirely sure what lay in store. More than once, he found himself questioning the wisdom of traveling to a remote, little-known place in search of something intangible. He could easily have stayed home, safe in content, reading scripts, and continuing the well-trodden path. But some quiet yearning pushed him onward, an echo from the days of his youth, when the world seemed vast and full of possibility. A week later, Morgan Freeman stepped out of a small, somewhat rickety airplane and onto a dusty tarmac under a sweltering sun. The coastal city, its name rarely mentioned in travel guides, bustled with a lively market at its center and a labyrinth of narrow, winding streets leading down toward the docks. The air smelled of fish, sea salt, and the tang of exotic spices. He was met by a short, wiry man who wore tattered cargo pants, a broad-brimmed hat, and a friendly grin. "I'm Jonas," the man said in slightly accented English. "Paul asked me to fetch you. He'll be waiting at the guest house." The car ride through the city's tight alleyways offered Morgan his first taste of the local culture. Vibrant murals decorated the walls, depicting mythical birds with rainbow feathers and waterfalls that seemed to flow off the painted stone. Street vendors sold fruit from small stands, calling out to passers-by in a language Morgan did not recognize. He found it all exhilarating. The unfamiliar shapes, the swirling colors, the sense that adventure lay just out of sight. Paul greeted him with a bear hug at the modest guest house. Gone was the timid, unsure filmmaker Morgan remembered from decades past. In his place stood a man whose eyes shone with determination, his sun-browned skin testament to countless days spent in the open. Nevertheless, a certain eagerness, almost childlike, remained in Paul's grin. "Morgan, I can't thank you enough for coming," he said. "I know it wasn't easy to slip away from your busy life." Morgan smiled. "Busy or not, I made a choice. This place, there's something about it already." Paul chuckled. "Just wait until you see what lies beyond the coast." That evening, they sat around a rickety wooden table in the guest house courtyard. Jonas joined them, along with two other team members, a quiet cameraman named Raphael and a local guide named Zara. Zara was slender, with an athletic build and an aura of quiet confidence. She had grown up in a village about 20 miles inland and knew more about the region's legends than most. As they talked, Morgan noticed Zara's intensity. She leaned forward whenever Paul mentioned the hidden lake, tapping the wooden table with her fingertips as though verifying every detail. A lantern flickered between them, casting dancing shadows on the courtyard walls. Zara spoke softly but with conviction, her accent adding a melodic lilt to her English. "My grandparents told me about a special body of water far into the jungle. They called it Tahana Kabir, the Lake of Echoing Dreams. They said it would grant visions to those who listened carefully to the wind at night. But not everyone who goes in search of it comes back." Morgan studied her, his curiosity aflame. "Why not?" She shrugged, a brief flicker of sadness in her eyes. Some say they lose themselves in the illusions, mistaking them for real life. Others speak of ancient guardians, but I've never encountered them, only heard the stories. Where I'm from, people have long learned to leave Tahana Kabir alone. Morgan glanced at Paul, who had that unmistakable gleam in his eyes, the look of someone chasing a once-in-a-lifetime discovery. "But you're determined to find it," Morgan said to him. Paul nodded, leaning back in his chair. "Not just find it, document it." Can you imagine the power of capturing this on film? If it really is a place where illusions or visions manifest, if we can present it honestly, well, maybe it'll prompt us all to question the nature of reality and the stories we inherit. And if it's just folklore, we'll show that too. Morgan listened, nodding. He appreciated Paul's balanced perspective. A younger man might have been completely blinded by the legend's allure. But Paul had the caution of a veteran documentarian. He wanted to tell the truth, whatever form that truth took. They spent the next few days gathering supplies and finalizing the boat they would use to travel to the archipelago. Jonas spent hours haggling for fuel, fresh water, and anything else the group might need once they ventured inland. The city revealed a subtle charm. Along the winding streets, Morgan encountered open-air cafes where local musicians strummed haunting melodies on homemade instruments. Children dashed between the stalls, their laughter echoing off the worn stone walls. Yet, amid this vibrant tapestry, a quiet apprehension settled upon Morgan. He noticed that whenever he mentioned the hidden lake to local shopkeepers, their smiles would fade. Some politely changed the subject, while others offered a curt shake of the head and walked away. It was as though they were all in on a secret that visitors were not meant to share. One afternoon, Morgan found himself in a small bookstore near the docks, sifting through dusty tomes in languages he couldn't read. A frail, elderly woman ran the shop, and though she barely spoke English, she seemed both curious and wary of him. When Morgan asked if she had anything on local legends, she hesitated before disappearing into a back room. She returned with a thin, hand-bound volume, the cover etched with symbols Morgan didn't recognize. She placed it gently on the counter, eyeing Morgan as if to gauge his intentions. Flipping through the pages, Morgan realized the text was in a local dialect. There were ink sketches of swirling patterns, possibly water, and silhouettes of figures that looked half human, half bird. One sketch depicted what appeared to be a grand body of water, surrounded by dense trees. At its center, there was a circle of light, or perhaps a reflection of the sun. Morgan pointed to it and glanced questioningly at the old woman. She mumbled a few words in her language, pointed to a tangle of lines around the lake that might have symbolized voices or echoes. Then, she closed the book softly and gave Morgan a grave stare, as though warning him that some secrets are best left uncovered. He purchased the book despite not being able to read it, feeling an odd pull. Tucking it into his bag, he exited the shop, the woman's eyes following him with a mixture of pity and concern. That night, he showed the sketches to Paul, Zara, and the rest of the group, but none of them recognized the script. Zara guessed it was a form of an older local dialect, more ancient than the one she'd learned from her grandparents. The pictures, though, seemed to confirm the existence of a significant body of water hidden somewhere deep in the jungle. Paul's excitement grew. Jonas admitted he had never ventured that far inland, and Raphael, the quiet cameraman, merely observed everything from the corner, as though carefully recording each detail in his mind. Finally, the day arrived to depart the coastal city for the archipelago. Their boat was modest, a patched-together vessel that had clearly seen better days. Yet, the captain, a stocky local with a weathered face named Benito, assured them it was sturdy enough for the short journey between the mainland and the isles. Morgan stood at the bow as they set off. The ocean breeze tugged gently at his clothing, carrying a salty tang that reminded him of life's constant change. He was stepping into another unknown, and though he was well aware of the unpredictability of such expeditions, he felt a rare sense of anticipation. There was a childlike wonder stirring in him that he had not felt in years. They sailed under a blazing sun, skirting reefs that glimmered with turquoise shallows, passing fishing boats whose captains eyed them curiously. Every so often, Paul or Jonas would point out a distant rocky outcrop or swirl of seabirds, commenting on the ecological marvels of the region. The archipelago soon appeared on the horizon. 5 or 6 islands of varying sizes, each veiled in thick jungle, with tall cliffs rising dramatically from the shoreline. In the distance, the sound of birds' strange, high-pitched calls echoed across the water, as if announcing the arrival of newcomers. By late afternoon, the boat navigated toward a wide, shallow bay of the largest island. Towering coconut palms and lush foliage crowded the beach, leaving just enough space for a narrow strip of sand. The boat's motors sputtered as Benito expertly guided them to the shore. They unloaded their supplies, the water lapping at their ankles as they waded to land. Beyond these trees, Benito said in halting English, there is a small path the locals used to follow. Zara knows more. I stay with the boat. This island, many stories. His eyes reflected a subtle trepidation, reinforcing the sense that they were leaving the realm of the ordinary. Morgan thanked Benito, and then the group pressed on, forging into the thick jungle with Zara in the lead. They moved slowly, weighed down by cameras, tripods, food packs, and mosquito netting. The jungle canopy filtered the daylight into a lush green glow. Strange calls echoed from unseen creatures in the distance, and the air was heavy with the fragrance of damp earth and vegetation. Zara moved with an ease that spoke to her experience in such terrain. She paused often to check the path, occasionally pointing out local plants, some used as medicines, others poisonous. Morgan marveled at how quickly the modern world seemed to vanish behind them. Within an hour, they were deep in the island's interior, the coastal breeze and the comforting sight of the boat left far behind. They made camp just before sunset in a small clearing beside a stream. Jonas and Paul pitched 2 sturdy tents, while Raphael set up his camera equipment, capturing shots of the dying light filtering through the trees. Morgan helped gather firewood, his breaths already ragged from the humidity. He was no stranger to roughing it, but it had been a long time since he'd ventured into a place so raw, so far removed from everyday comforts. That night, the forest seemed to breathe around them. A chorus of insects and nocturnal creatures pulsed in waves, rising and falling like an otherworldly lullaby. The moon was only a sliver, hidden behind drifting clouds, leaving their clearing illuminated mostly by the soft glow of the campfire. They ate a simple meal of rice, beans, and dried fruits, exchanging subdued conversation. Yet, as the night wore on, Morgan noticed an undercurrent of restlessness in Paul. The filmmaker's eyes flicked into the darkness beyond the fire's light, as though expecting to see some hidden presence step into view. Zara caught Morgan's gaze and offered a slight, knowing smile, as if to say, "Yes, I feel it too, the weight of this place." Eventually, they turned in, each person retreating to their tent. Morgan lay awake for a long while, listening to the forest's lullaby. His thoughts drifted to that phone call from Paul, to the thin, hand-bound book with cryptic sketches, to the old woman in the bookstore who had watched him with such apprehension. He recalled Zara's words about illusions and guardians, and a flicker of doubt passed through his mind. What if the legends were true? What if this journey would take him to a place far beyond the boundaries of the known world? Yet, despite the uncertainty, and perhaps because of it, he felt a tingle of excitement rather than dread. An actor's life, for all its glamour, sometimes lacked genuine moments of unfiltered wonder. Now, that sense of wonder was all around him, woven into the very leaves and the shimmering starlight. Morning broke to the loud chatter of parrots swooping overhead. The team rose early, packed up the camp, and pressed onward. The trail wound deeper into the forest, past towering ancient trees that seemed to watch them in silence. Moss-covered roots slithered across the ground, demanding caution. As they advanced, the lush vegetation became denser, the air richer with the scent of blooming flowers. Now and again, beams of sunlight penetrated the canopy, striking the forest floor in golden pools that looked almost mystical. Zara stopped them around midday, near a massive rock formation etched with what appeared to be petroglyphs. The carvings depicted spiral patterns, stylized animals, and a central figure with arms extended upward. It was reminiscent of the images Morgan had seen in the old book. "This is a marker," Zara explained, running her hand gently over the grooves. "I remember seeing something like it when I was a child. My grandfather told me it was one of the ways the ancestors navigated. If we see this sign, then the path to the lake is nearby." Morgan and Paul exchanged glances. This was the first concrete confirmation they were heading the right way. They pressed on with renewed vigor. Jonas cut a path through thick vines with a machete, and each step felt like they were peeling back the layers of a living tapestry. The forest grew quieter, the usual chorus of birds and insects seeming to fade, replaced by a hushed, expectant atmosphere. By late afternoon, they reached a broad clearing, and everyone halted in unison. Before them stretched what appeared to be a large basin, dry and covered in lush grass. A ring of giant stones circled this depression, each stone carved with the same spiral motifs they had seen earlier. Morgan's heart skipped a beat. Could this be the legendary lake? Except there was no water. "Tahana Kabir," Zara whispered, her tone reverent. "Or where it's supposed to be." Paul glanced at Zara, puzzled. "But it's just grassland. Are we sure we're in the right place?" Zara nodded, stepping forward cautiously. "The stories say the lake appears only when it chooses. It's part of the mystery. Sometimes it's here, sometimes it's not." Morgan followed, feeling an electric charge in the air. He crouched down, running his fingers over the grass. The earth beneath was unusually cool to the touch, despite the jungle's heat. A subtle, almost indescribable hum seemed to emanate from the center of the basin, perhaps just his imagination. Raphael, rarely speaking, began filming the clearing from different angles, capturing the wind's ripple through the grass, the imposing stones, and the expressions of the explorers as they stood in silent awe. Zara led them to the center of the basin, where she knelt and pressed her ear to the ground. She beckoned Morgan to do the same. Hesitantly, he complied, placing his ear against the cool grass. For a moment, he thought he heard a distant rush of water, as though a river raged deep beneath the earth. "It's faint," Zara murmured, "but there's something almost like a heartbeat." Paul joined them, listening intently. Jonas stood watch near the perimeter, scanning the surrounding jungle as though wary of unexpected company. The group lingered there until sunset, searching for any sign of water, but the basin remained resolutely dry. At dusk, they set up camp on the edge of the clearing. Despite the anticlimax, a sense of anticipation thickened the air. They had come all this way, drawn by a legend, only to find an empty hollow. Yet none of them felt disappointed. On the contrary, it seemed they had stepped onto the stage of a grand riddle, one whose answer lurked just out of sight. That night, Morgan found sleep elusive. He kept replaying the day's revelations in his mind. The silent forest, the carved stones, the cool grass of the basin. Drifting in and out of light doze, he found himself half dreaming, half listening to the nighttime sounds. Then, at some indeterminate hour, he was jolted awake by an echoing whisper that slid through the camp. He sat up, heart pounding. Across the dying embers of the fire, he saw Zara stir. She glanced at him, eyes wide. "You heard it too," she whispered, her voice trembling with excitement or fear. Morgan nodded. The whisper had been faint, almost imperceptible, like someone calling from the center of the basin. A breeze rustled through the clearing, carrying a chill that seemed out of place in the humid jungle. Without a word, Morgan and Zara crept out of their tents, carefully stepping around the sleeping forms of Paul, Jonas, and Raphael. The moon had finally emerged from behind the clouds, casting a pale, silver glow over the grass. Together, they made their way to the basin's center. What happened next caused Morgan's breath to catch in his throat. The grass in the basin glistened, as though laced with dew, but it was more than that, almost a spectral shimmer. Zara knelt down, touching one hand to the ground. Then she gasped, pointing just a few feet away. A swirl of light, faint at first, seemed to emanate from the ground. Morgan blinked, wondering if it was a trick of moonlight, but the swirl had a gentle motion, as though water was rippling up from beneath. He took a step closer, eyes locked on the phenomenon. Then, in a heartbeat, the swirl vanished. The basin went dark, the grass no longer glowed. All that remained was the moon's soft reflection. Morgan felt a surge of adrenaline. He and Zara exchanged glances, silently confirming that both had witnessed the same thing. They returned to camp, uncertain whether to wake the others. In the end, they decided to wait until morning to see if the phenomenon repeated itself. Yet Morgan barely slept for the remainder of the night, his mind racing with possibilities. Had they really glimpsed the first stirrings of the legendary lake? Or was it some natural phenomenon, the glow of phosphorescent insects or algae? When dawn arrived, they convened around the smoldering fire. Morgan recounted the events to Paul, Jonas, and Raphael. Zara added her own perspective, insisting it was unlike anything she had ever seen. Paul was electrified. He ordered Raphael to keep the camera ready at all times, determined to capture definitive footage. Jonas appeared uneasy, glancing at the looming jungle as though he feared they had awakened a long-dormant presence. With renewed purpose, they spent the day exploring the clearing, examining the ring of stones more thoroughly, and setting up small motion sensor cameras around the perimeter. Paul thought that if the phenomenon repeated itself, they might capture some audio or visual proof, even if it occurred in the dead of night. Morgan, meanwhile, found himself drawn to the stones. Running his hands over their surface, he discovered patterns too faint to be visible at first glance. Layer upon layer of spirals, shapes, and symbols etched with breathtaking precision. It was as if each stone told a story in cryptic code. Even though he couldn't decipher it, Morgan sensed a narrative unspooling in his mind. Images of long ago people gathering around these very stones, chanting, gazing skyward, waiting. Night descended once more, and they took their positions. Morgan and Zara volunteered to watch the basin from midnight until sunrise, while Paul and Jonas would monitor until midnight. Raphael moved quietly among them, setting up a camera near the basin with a night vision lens, occasionally adjusting the angles and checking the batteries. For hours, nothing happened. The forest night was noisy, chirping insects, an occasional cry from a distant bird, but the basin remained serene, grass whispering in the breeze. Morgan felt fatigue tugging at his eyelids, but the memory of last night's shimmering swirl kept him alert. Zara, too, sat cross-legged, tension visible in her posture. Sometime after midnight, the sounds of the forest seemed to hush. Morgan watched as the breeze died down, the grass in the basin becoming perfectly still. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed a flicker of movement. He blinked, focusing on a spot near one of the carved stones on the far edge of the basin. In the faint glow of the moon, a shimmering haze coalesced, like heat waves rising from hot asphalt, but it held a soft blue hue. He nudged Zara, pointing silently. She followed his gaze, eyes widening. The haze expanded, drifting slowly across the basin's surface. Raphael, who was stationed behind a camera near a tree, saw it too. He gestured frantically, adjusting the camera to capture the phenomenon. The haze drifted like a phantom, reflecting moonlight in mesmerizing patterns. Morgan felt his pulse thunder in his ears. He had never seen anything remotely like it. The shimmering moved toward the center of the basin, spreading outward as though forming an invisible pool. And then it began to sink downward like water draining into the earth, or perhaps water rising. The effect was impossible to define, a paradoxical merging of illusions. Suddenly, a hush fell over the jungle. The insects stopped their symphony. In that ringing silence, Morgan heard a distant trickle, as if a stream was flowing beneath them. Then the grass in the basin started to shift, flattening as if pressed down by a gentle but unstoppable force. Bit by bit, the reflection of moonlight intensified until it was almost blinding. Then, as though in a slow, deliberate dance, a thin layer of water seemed to materialize across the center of the basin. Morgan blinked multiple times, convinced his eyes must be betraying him. But Zara reached out. She was close enough to dip her fingers in the newly formed puddle. She gasped softly, her fingertips coming away wet, glistening in the moonlight. A wave of awe, and perhaps fear, coursed through them. Inch by inch, the water spread, forming a growing mirror that captured the moon's pale face and the silhouettes of the surrounding stones. Morgan found himself holding his breath. He could see his own reflection wavering, as though some unseen hand were painting the surface with liquid silver. Then, just as swiftly as it had begun, the expansion halted. The water stilled, forming a small circular pond at the very center of the basin, no larger than a modest swimming pool. The rest of the grass around it remained dry, dew-kissed, but unremarkable. Paul, having awakened to the commotion, rushed to the edge of the basin, Jonas close behind, both men speechless at what they beheld. Raphael kept filming, the whir of his camera the only sound in the motionless night. The new pond shimmered, reflecting the moon and the starlit sky with surreal clarity. Zara whispered something in her native tongue, perhaps a prayer or a plea. Paul's eyes were wet with tears of wonder. Jonas stood rooted to the spot, his expression a mask of astonishment. Morgan approached the edge of the water slowly, each step measured. The temperature around them seemed to have dropped by several degrees. A gentle mist rose from the surface of the pond, swirling in the moonlight. He crouched, staring into the water, half expecting to see something gazing back. For a moment, he saw only his own reflection. Then the water rippled, as though stirred from below. He caught a faint shape forming in the reflection, a silhouette of a tall figure, features indistinct, yet exuding an unmistakable aura of calm and strength. Morgan blinked, his heart pounding in his chest. The image wavered, and then it was gone, replaced by nothing more than the glint of moonlight on water. He glanced around, wondering if anyone else had seen it. Paul, Zura, Jonas, and Raphael were all transfixed by the spectacle in their own ways. Unsure of what he had witnessed, Morgan decided to remain silent for the moment. Whether it was a trick of the light, his imagination, or it was something else entirely, he couldn't be certain. In hushed reverence, the group watched the strange pond for the rest of the night, taking shifts to film and rest. No more illusions or shimmering figures appeared, though the pond remained, gently swirling under the night sky until the first hints of dawn approached. As sunlight crept over the trees, painting the clearing in shades of gold, the water began to recede. It vanished so gradually that it was difficult to pinpoint the exact moment of its disappearance. By the time the sun was fully above the horizon, the basin was once again a field of soft grass, save for a damp circle in the center. The only evidence of the night's miracle was the lingering sensation of awe in each traveler's heart and the footage captured by Raphael's camera. They gathered around the extinguished fire to discuss what had happened, the morning light revealing the exhaustion and wonder on every face. Zara's excitement was palpable. She had never believed she would witness the lake's manifestation. Paul struggled to find words that adequately described the scene. Jonas seemed uncharacteristically quiet, still grappling with the reality of it all. Morgan felt a slow smile grow on his face. Despite the strangeness, despite the weariness, he felt more alive than he had in years. Whatever was happening here, it defied easy explanation. And that was precisely why he had come, to stand at the threshold of the unknown and see what it had to offer. Paul cleared his throat. We have footage. We can analyze it, try to understand the phenomenon. Maybe there's a logical explanation. Groundwater seeping up due to some geothermal event, or, well, I don't know. Zara shook her head softly. My people's legends spoke of illusions, visions, and guardians. Sometimes science and legend can intersect, but I feel this is something more than just a quirk of geology. Morgan nodded. I agree, Zara. And it's too soon to make conclusions. We've only seen the beginning. Paul took a deep breath, regaining some of his composure. Well, I suggest we stay here a while longer. Let's see if it happens again, or if anything else occurs. Now that we've seen the lake appear, even if only partially, it might decide to show us more. And we'll be ready. They spent the day in preparation, reorganizing their supplies, and ensuring the cameras had fresh batteries. Jonas took stock of their food and water, reminding everyone they only had so many days' worth. If we're staying longer, we might need to arrange another supply trip, he warned. Raphael silently reviewed the footage on his device. Though he was a man of few words, the awe on his face said enough. Morgan asked if he could watch some of it, and Raphael obliged. The night vision recording revealed the haze drifting across the basin, the shimmering glow, and the pond taking form. It was mesmerizing, otherworldly. Yet, the camera had not captured any silhouette in the water's reflection. No tall figure, no ephemeral face. Morgan felt a mixture of relief and disappointment. Perhaps he had imagined it, after all. Or maybe some things weren't meant to be caught on film. That evening, clouds gathered overhead, and the air grew thick with the promise of rain. Thunder rumbled in the distance. As night fell, they found themselves waiting again, tension mounting in the oppressive humidity. Would the lake manifest a second time, even in stormy weather? Lightning flickered across the sky, briefly illuminating the clearing in stark white. The group huddled under a makeshift tarp, trying to keep the cameras and equipment dry. Rain began to fall, softly at first, then more insistently, drenching the basin. The carved stones glistened, water pouring in rivulets over their ancient patterns. Hours passed, the storm intensifying. Morgan listened to the pounding rain, the wind whipping the tarps, thunder shaking the earth. The lake, if it appeared, would be impossible to discern amid the storm's deluge. Drenched and chilled, they eventually decided there was little point in braving the downpour. They retreated to their tents, leaving only a waterproof camera set up under a protective covering, aimed at the basin. It was a sleepless night. The storm raged until just before dawn. When daylight broke, the basin was a marshy field of mud and puddles. No sign of a mystical pond, no ghostly glow, just the aftermath of a typical tropical storm. Disappointment hung over the camp, though none of them said it aloud. 2 more days passed in relative quiet. The forest around them resumed its usual rhythm, the wildlife emerging again, the clearing drying out under the hot sun. At night, they kept watch, but the phenomenon did not reoccur. The group's morale began to waver. Jonas talked of returning to the boat, concerned they were pushing their luck. Zara suggested exploring deeper into the island. Perhaps there were other sites connected to the lake's legend that might offer clues. Paul, torn between caution and curiosity, turned to Morgan for guidance. You've seen more of the world than most. What do you think we should do? Stay here and wait? Or we'll try to push further in? Morgan gazed at the ring of carved stones. I think we've only scratched the surface. The lake manifested once. It might again. But perhaps you're right. Maybe we need to understand the wider context. If there are more markings, more clues, we might learn when or why the lake appears. We shouldn't just passively wait. A flicker of renewed determination crossed Paul's face. Then we press on, he declared. Thus began the next phase of their expedition. With Zara's guidance, they explored a perimeter around the basin, searching for more petroglyphs or paths that might lead them to other significant sites. Jonas grumbled about the diminishing supplies, but grudgingly followed. Raphael recorded everything with meticulous care, capturing footage of the lush jungle, the towering cliffs, and the group's relentless search. They discovered a dried stream bed that seemed to wind around the basin's periphery, leading toward a cluster of massive rocks in the distance. The stream bed was lined with peculiar, oval stones that glimmered in the sunlight, hinting at mineral deposits. Morgan knelt to examine them, wondering if the lake's water might be filtered through these rocks, lending it some mystical property. But for now, it was only speculation. Days passed, marked by sweaty treks through tangled vines, encounters with exotic birds, and the occasional glimpse of small jungle creatures scurrying away. The deeper they went, the more they sensed the forest was aware of their presence, an intangible feeling that the trees themselves bore witness to their quest. The tension between hope and uncertainty wove through the group. Jonas pushed to ration their food carefully. Zara's calm resolve never wavered. though Morgan sometimes caught a flicker of worry in her eyes. Paul alternated between bouts of exhilaration and moments of quiet introspection, as if he couldn't quite believe he was so close to the story of a lifetime, yet might leave without answers. Raphael continued his silent documentation, capturing every detail with a professional stoicism that belied the wonder shining in his gaze. After nearly a week of exploration, they found it, or perhaps it found them. They were trudging up a gentle slope when they emerged onto a plateau dotted with ancient ruins. The air was cooler here, the canopy thinner, allowing shafts of light to illuminate broken columns and half-collapsed walls. The group stood in stunned silence. There were carvings everywhere, swirling motifs reminiscent of the basin stones, but far more elaborate and extensive. Zara exhaled sharply, her voice trembling. I had no idea there were structures like this on the island. Nobody told me anything like this existed. Morgan stepped forward, his footsteps echoing across the mossy stones. It was as if they had stumbled upon a lost city. He could make out the faint outline of what might have been a courtyard. There were pedestals scattered about, some empty, others topped with cracked stones shaped like bowls or basins. Could this be connected to the lake? Paul asked, voice hushed as though he were in a temple. Zara nodded. Likely. The carvings depict water, spirals, and see that figure. She pointed to a large engraving of a being with elongated arms and legs, surrounded by wavy lines. It could represent a guardian or spirit of water. Jonas let out a low whistle. We could spend months trying to understand this place. Raphael was already filming every inch, zooming in on the carvings, panning across the ruined walls. Morgan felt a hum in the air again, a sense that they were on the cusp of unraveling a secret older than any living memory. Night fell quickly on the plateau, and they set up camp within the ruins, careful to disturb as little as possible. As they gathered around a small fire, the wind whispered through the crumbling walls, creating soft moans. It was eerie yet mesmerizing. They spoke in low tones, each person sharing their theories. Perhaps these ruins were once a ceremonial center for those who worshiped the lake, or maybe it served a practical function, harnessing the water for some ancient rite. At the edge of the firelight, Morgan caught a glint of something metallic. Curious, he moved closer, discovering a small metallic pendant lying half-buried in the dirt. It was shaped like a spiral, the same motif he had seen over and over. He picked it up, brushing away the dirt. A wave of déjà vu washed over him, a fleeting sense that the pendant held a resonance with everything they'd experienced thus far. Pocketing it, Morgan decided he would examine it more closely in the morning. For now, exhaustion tugged at his consciousness, but as he lay down to rest, the pendant pressed against his thigh like a silent reminder that the journey was far from over. He dreamed of water rising beneath a moonlit sky, of voices echoing across the basin, calling him by name. In the dream, he stood on the edge of the hidden lake, his reflection intermingled with countless others, faces flickering in and out of focus. And above it all, a gentle voice, not his own, yet so familiar, spoke a single phrase: the greatest truths lie where reality and myth converge. He awoke in a cold sweat to find the first rays of dawn illuminating the ruins. In that fragile hour, he wondered if he was truly prepared for what they might uncover, if any of them were. Yet there was no turning back. The lake, the ruins, the swirling visions all beckoned like a siren's call, and Morgan Freeman knew he had a role to play in this story that was still unfolding. He rose, determined, and glanced around at his sleeping companions, at the ancient stones that bore silent witness to ages past. Whatever mysteries lay hidden in this jungle, he would see them through to the end. Perhaps the world at large would never believe what they found, or maybe Paul's film would shine a new light on the boundaries between legend and truth. Either way, Morgan felt the thrill of a fresh chapter opening before him, a chapter that would test the limits of both imagination and resolve. Little did he know that the most startling revelations still waited, drifting between the threshold of dream and reality, ready to reshape everything he thought he understood about the power of hidden places and the tenacity of the human.